This is Shelly Craft coming to you live on SNN Live. We're at the LD Micro 11th Annual Main Event in Bel Air, California, 2018. I have with me today Adrian Goldfarb from Duos Technologies Group. It's a publicly traded company, and the symbol is DUOT on OTC markets. Adrian, welcome to SNN Live.
Hi, Shelley. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Let's get started with a brief overview of the company, and we'll go from there.
Sure. So the company got its start back a few years ago, primarily in the advanced intelligent analytics business, primarily focused on security, and has really morphed from that time into developing those technologies and applying them to a number of different industries, but most notably the freight rail industry.
So, Adrian, let's get a little history on the company.
Sure. The company's history goes back actually quite a long way, but the most important part of the history goes into around the 2010 framework when the company received a contract to automate the inspection of trains crossing the U.S.-Mexican border on approximately 4 lines, plus some things that were deep into the heart of Mexico. The particular freight company was wrestling with an issue that was generated by getting fined for carrying contraband and illegal riders and needed a technology solution. So the company built out its technology from there and has really made great strides moving forward and developing that into other areas.
What is the company's competitive advantage?
So the competitive advantage for the company is that we have 2 basic underlying technology products, Centrochrome, Presidium. The names are not really that important. One of them does advanced intelligent analytics, including what's very, very popular today as far as people looking at technologies to do with artificial intelligence, and developing those plus a way to present that to companies. So rather than just having a technology and it being kind of an esoteric thing that just gets provided to the company itself, we built out a technology that says we can go into a company now, say, you're wrestling with a certain issue, we can apply our analytics technology to that, present that in a way that the company can make use of that information and integrate what you already have.
So what does the competitive landscape look like?
Competitive landscape is an interesting one. It's an relatively expensive business to be in. And in terms of certain industries, we really don't face that much competition in the specific areas that we're in. Let me clarify that somewhat. We used to be primarily in the security space. There is a lot of competition. Most of the camera manufacturers now have software, they have analytics, and so consequently that's a hard space to be in. However, if you move that up out of the security area and into more of the inspection area, in this case particular mechanical inspection, by applying those technologies, you'll find there's not that much competition. We also have a big advantage in that all of our technologies have been verified by a division of the Federal Railroad Administration who goes through and looks at those things. Because remember, you could be supplying something on a live rail line, and consequently, they have to determine is that something that's safe. So the competitive landscape, it's an interesting business to be in. It's probably more cooperative than anything else. There's a couple of competitors that exist around the world. We talk with them, and everybody is aiming at a slightly different area. So there's as much cooperation as there is competition.
So let's discuss the unmet need that you fulfill.
Okay. If you talk about the freight rail industry, they have a specific need that as a part of the Federal Railroad Administration regulations, each train consist. So a consist is all of the cars put together with a locomotive or multiple locomotives, must be inspected before it leaves a rail yard. And typically they enter a rail yard on many more occasions than you would think, because if you can imagine a freight car that's transiting from one side of the country to the other, it just doesn't start out in the East Coast and end up on the West Coast. It goes through several rail yards. So the unmet need is that when that train enters into a rail yard, it has to be inspected. So how is the inspection done? The inspection is today done by, in effect, railroad engineers walking both sides of the trains. There's usually 2. The train can be up to 1.5 miles or longer, and you may have 100 or more cars that you have to inspect. And it's exactly as they sound. They go up and down. They have clipboards and they have flashlights, and they go and they look for inspections. The problem with that is you're dealing with, first of all, human nature in that. If it's very cold out, which it could be up in Minnesota in the winter, if it's extremely hot out, which could be Texas or Mexico in the summer, the likelihood is that that inspection is going to go faster and that you're not going to discover all of the issues. The other part of the unmet need is that in those trains, they're not going on top of the train. Okay. They're also not going very much underneath. They can look from the side underneath, but they're not going underneath. It's too dangerous. If the train starts moving, people get killed that way. And so the unmet need is to evaluate what is going on with that train.
Now, what is the target market? Obviously, it's all of the big train companies, but is there other uses?
Yes, the target market, let's talk about rail first. When I'm speaking about rail in this particular instance, what I just described, we're talking about freight rail. So in North America, there are 7 what they call Class 1 freight companies, and they pretty much manage all of the freight traffic throughout the network. And they're names that would be everyone would be familiar with. You've also got the passenger transit market. That's a slightly different market in that they're not so concerned what might be on the sides, because typically the doors don't open. You're not really worried about what's on top. You might be worried about what's underneath. You're also talking about the difference for private industry, which is freight rail, versus like state and local, or federal in the case of like an Amtrak, whereby you're trying to sell a system to that. So there's 2 different markets even within freight rail. Then you can get down to things like stations and so forth, and there's a lot of different ways that we can enter the market, because our underlying platforms, the ones that I described earlier, are applicable in this case. It's just a question of how they're applied. If you get outside of freight rail, what you're looking at is the standard security market that we've been in. And we've moved somewhat upmarket in that, as I mentioned earlier, the margins are pretty tight in the security market itself. And so consequently, we only take on big projects. We recently actually announced a project for a bank where we're installing our security systems throughout the bank's multiple locations. Another area, which is a different industry for us, in something we call advanced logistics information systems. More broadly, you can describe that as if you take something like a retailer might have multiple distribution centers. This is where the goods are brought in from their various suppliers and then shipped out to the stores. The management of those distribution centers is quite complex. And so you have a system whereby today, for example, the retailer might have gatehouses that are manned, and then you have a truck coming up and the driver will interface with the gatehouse operator. And, that takes time and there can be mistakes and you don't really know what goes on within that yard. The way that our systems, once they're implemented, and this is a real case study that I'm talking about, is that you take the gatehouse operator out of that equation, the truck is inspected using the same technology that we would use for the trains. The truck then approaches up, the driver gets out, and instead of interfacing with the gatehouse operator, they're interfacing with a kiosk that we have. They enter certain information, the truck is inspected, and then that information, assuming they're supposed to be there and all the numbers are correct, the gate will automatically open and direct the driver to which bay they're going to go into. Same thing on the outbound. So now what you have a complete record of that truck's ingress and egress from that distribution center. And the ROI for a company doing like that, believe it or not, the payback period is about a year on a project like that. It's a multi-million-dollar project.
What's your background?
So my background is I'm a financial specialist. I've always been involved in financial matters of one and another. Most recently, I've spent about the last 10 years in the microcap public companies as Chief Financial Officer. My history also goes back into much larger companies. I've spent some time with large IT and technology companies, mostly in the software business, but always with a financial angle to it.
So you're a public company, so tell me what you can, you're allowed to. What are some growth drivers looking forward?
So it's a very interesting time to be doing the interview. The big impediment to us was we ended up being somewhat cash constrained last year. Remember, what I've been describing is we've been dealing with some very, very large companies. It takes a lot of money to be able to execute those projects, and you cannot take on a big project without knowing the complete. I mean, you can take it on, but you'll be finished pretty soon if you don't execute correctly. So we solved that problem with the raise that we did last year. And that's really put us on the target to growth now. So we're having a tremendous year right now. Revenues are significantly up from the prior year. We're pretty much cash flow neutral at this point. We've given out guidance for next year, which is a pretty decent up percentage on where we were before. And we expect that there's going to be plenty of demand in the industries that I described for our product sets, and we see a very, very bright future for the company.
So, Adrian, let's get your website out for more information for our investor audience.
Sure, absolutely. It's www.duostech.com.
Ladies and gentlemen, Adrian Goldfarb, Duos Technologies Group. It's a publicly traded company, and the symbol is DUOT on the OTC markets. I'm Shelley Kraft. This is SNN Live, and we're coming to you live from the LD Micro 11th Annual Main Event in Bel Air, California, 2018. Adrian,
Thanks,
my
Shelley.
pleasure.
My pleasure.
Thank you.